Widowed rancher searched for milk for his newborn until the neighbor girl knocked with a full breast. Dry Willow, Colorado. Early spring 1879. I remember the date like it was etched into my soul, a scar on the timeline of my life. The air was a bitter enemy, the kind of cold that gnawed through wool and leather and settled deep in the marrow. Snow, indifferent and heavy, still lay in thick, crusty drifts in the ravines where the sun had no mercy and no entrance. The wind god, that wind, didn't just blow. It spoke. It was a raw, malevolent presence whining through the splintered fence lines and rattling the skeletal bare branches of the cottonwoods along the creek bed. Every gust was a promise that winter wasn't done with its cruelty yet. Inside the cabin built over a decade ago with hands that now trembled like a newborn colt's, the only defense against the invading cold was the dying, weary effort of the stone hearth. I sat there, slumped, the weight of the past 2 months of physical suffocating pressure on my chest. In my arms, my daughter Clara wailed. Her sound was the knife that twisted the pressure in my chest. It wasn't the robust, demanding bawl of a healthy child. It was a thin, high-exhausted sound punctuated by small, desperate, shallow gasps. A sound that stripped a father of his dignity. My shirt smelled of failure, a greasy, nauseating mix of old sweat, dense fireplace smoke, and the sour stomach-turning tang of spilled goat's milk. I hadn't known what a man was supposed to smell like after his world ended, but I knew with the certainty of lead in my belly that it wasn't this hollow stench. My hands, once steady enough to castrate a bull or drive a nail straight through unforgiving oak, were shaking now violently, uncontrollably. I tried again, a desperate, futile ritual to raise the bottle to Clara's pale, dry lips. "Come on, baby girl. Please, for the love of God," I whispered, my voice. A rasping, unrecognizable sound scraped raw by grief and sleeplessness. It was the naked plea of a strong man broken down to begging a tiny, fragile creature for the simple mercy of survival. "Just a little more, please, Clara. For your papa, just try." The goat's milk, warmed just moments ago near the last flicker of the flame, was already cooling to a lukewarm disappointment. It sloshed carelessly against her chin, wetting the flannel swaddling that felt too loose around her small frame. Clara turned her head violently away with a guttural, furious moan, a sound of rejection that felt like a punch to my gut. Her mouth sealed tight in stubborn refusal. Her tiny curled fists pounded weakly, pitifully against my stained shirt. The cries grew louder, sharper, hitting me. Not like sound, but like physical blows, like gravel thrown against glass. I couldn't hold it back any longer. A deep, tearing groan ripped out of my chest before I could clamp my jaw down to stop it. It was less a sound of immediate pain and more the terrible noise of a massive, heavy timber beam finally snapping under an impossible load. I hadn't truly rested since the night Sarah died. Sarah. My Sarah. The love of my life. She bled out while the midwife was still wiping the new life Clara from the birthing stool. I could still smell the copper tang of iron and the suffocating, desperate heat in that room. The midwife's panicked, hushed, useless words and the sudden, awful, permanent quiet that settled in after Clara's first triumphant yet fatal cry. I had held it all together by sheer thread, by a stubborn refusal to fall down, and by a desperate, almost lunatic focus on the single next task: bury Sarah. Keep Clara alive. I buried my wife on a Tuesday. Clara turned 2 weeks old on that same Tuesday. The arithmetic of grief was brutal. Now she was 2 months old, and she was starving. The terror of her hunger was the only thing sharper, more immediate, and more demanding than my grief. It eclipsed everything. I had tried every ridiculous, desperate thing a resourceful man could think of: goat milk strained 3 times through cheesecloth thin rice water that barely coated the tongue. Even sugar water once. A vile, sticky experiment I instantly regretted when she screamed in rejection, a sound that felt like a final judgment against my capabilities as a father, as a man. I had walked this valley like a beggar carrying a cursed treasure, my boots heavy with shame and the damp cold. I knocked on every door within 5 miles, from the dilapidated mud-caked shacks on the creek bank to the most prosperous, well-maintained homesteads north of the river. My rehearsed line was always the same, tight and forced through a dry throat. "My girl needs milk. Does anyone have a nursing wife with milk to spare?" Most turned me away with a sigh and a kind, defeated look that knew my pain too well. "Hard times, Mr. Caldwell. Wives dried up 2 winters ago. Try the goats, man." One grizzled old man sitting on his porch carving a length of hickory didn't even meet my eye. He just grunted the sound cold as riverstone. That's what bottles are for Caldwell. You'll figure it out. We all did. but I hadn't figured it out. I was failing her slowly, excruciatingly. Clara was losing the soft, plump fullness of a newborn. Her cheeks were hollowed shadows falling beneath her eyes. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and her breathing was too quick, too shallow, too labored. Every gasp felt like the hammer striking the anvil of a ticking clock against my ribs. I stood up slowly, swaying a little, the sheer physical exhaustion making the cabin spin. I rocked her automatically, a movement of purely muscle memory. I walked toward the front door where the wind was shrieking its endless, maddening complaint. I reached out a rough, cracked hand, the skin dried and torn from working wire saddlery and frozen rope, and fumbled for a bent nail. I opened the door just enough to slide a small, torn, ragged piece of brown paper onto the outside frame, securing it under the nail's heavy head. The uneven script, scrawled clumsily by my own shaking hand in the weak light of the dawn, read, "If anyone has milk to spare, please help my baby girl. She is fading." I slammed the door shut violently. The wind hammered against it, immediately testing the frame, trying to force its way back in. I didn't know which act was more shameful, the desperate, pathetic hope clinging to that note exposed to the eyes of the valley, or the sickening realization that I had nothing, absolutely nothing left to offer my child. Back by the hearth, I sank onto the floor, pulling Clara tightly to me, trying to hum a tune Sarah used to sing while we danced in the kitchen during a thunderstorm. My voice was broken dry, completely unusable. The abandoned bottle, a symbol of my defeat, rolled slightly on the uneven floorboards. Clara's cries had worn down, thank God, into thin, exhausted whimpers between hiccups, the sound of true famine. She curled into me, a tiny furnace of distress, but burning low. I pressed my lips to her hot, damp forehead. "I am trying, Sarah," I whispered into the darkness of my coat, addressing the ghost that sat perpetually beside me. "I swear I am trying to keep your light lit. Don't let me lose her." The fire popped, sending my towering, mournful shadow leaping across the far wall. I leaned back against the support post just for a moment, and let my eyes close in surrender. The darkness was an immediate, greedy comfort. But Clara gave a sharp, tiny moan, a sound like a small, wounded bird, and it snapped the fragile thread of my exhaustion. My arms tightened around her instantly, possessively, the father's instinct overriding the body's need for sleep. I had faced down charging panic stallions with only a rope and a prayer. I had endured storms that tore the roof off my barn and nearly took the whole wooden structure with it. But I had never known fear like this, the fear of absolute, irreversible helplessness. Even when I stood beside Sarah's fresh grave, the cold dirt caked under my nails and a hole in my chest where my future had been, I hadn't felt this. My daughter was all that remained, a fragile, dependent heartbeat, a delicate vessel of memory. Tonight, the hands that tamed the wildest horses felt utterly useless, incapable of solving the simplest, most essential problem of all, giving life itself. The wind picked up, escalating into a high, screaming banshee of sound. Rain began slashing sideways against the cabin's single warped window pane, each gust making the loose glass rattle like a bone shaking violently in a fever dream. I resumed pacing the wooden floor, the tiny infant pressed against my shoulder, trying to impart my own residual heat. Her cries were now reduced to pitiful, rasping gasps, the sound of a child whose body had truly run out of the strength even to scream her protest. The fire was dying, and I had nothing left to feed it but broken furniture. Last week, in a fit of cold, logical despair, I'd chopped up Sarah's old oak rocking chair, the one she'd sat in while stitching Clara's layette. I deeply regretted it now. It felt like burning a piece of her soul. The room was bone-achingly cold, the temperature dropping fast toward freezing. Then came the knock. 3 distinct sharp raps cutting cleanly, forcefully through the howl of the wind and the rattling glass. I froze mid-step, my body rigid with shock. For a long, confusing second, I believed my mind, frayed raw by lack of sleep, had finally invented the sound. But it came again, firmer, clearly not the random rhythmic hammering of the storm. It was a person. A soul. I walked to the door, my heart pounding a furious, desperate rhythm against my ribs, and flung it open with a reckless disregard for the wind. A woman stood beneath the barely there porch beam. She was soaked through her heavy wool shawl, plastered to her back, water streaming in dark lines from the hem of her coarse coat. Her mud-caked boots sunk deep into the mire. The blonde hair that had escaped her bonnet was slicked flat to her pale cheeks. She held a canvas satchel clutched tight in one hand, the other hand holding the neck of her coat closed against the biting cold. Eliza Rowe, the neighbor girl, barely 22, who lived 3 miles west, a solitary rancher like me, but a widow too. I stared, my mind slow and muddy, refusing to process the sheer impossibility of her standing there. She looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, still bearing the fresh mark of tears. Yet they were steady, focused with a terrible singular purpose, only on the bundle in my arms. "I saw your note, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice trembling, thin but somehow audible against the wind's roar. I've heard her crying at night. Even from my place, the wind carries it." She took a shaky, deep breath, the sight of the starving child in my arms forcing the private, heavy words out of her. "Let me feed her, please. Right now." I just stared, my brain refusing to connect the words to the action, the offer to the reality. My eyes drifted down to the canvas satchel, then back up to her face, a confused, vacant question hanging in the air between us. Eliza's voice dropped to a quiet, painful, almost raw whisper, heavy with her own secret. "I still have Milk, my boy. He passed 6 weeks ago. He was 11 weeks old when the fever took him." Rain streaked down her cheek, but I knew it mingled with the grief that was perpetually etched on her face. I have to do something with it," she said, barely audible over the gust, her eyes pleading for release. It was a plea for herself, a desperate need to convert her immense, useless supply into purpose, as much as it was a plea for Clara. "Let me help her, Ethan. Please." I stepped aside, speechless. The shame of being seen in this broken state, the shock of her immense, heartbreaking offer, the raw, mirror-like pain in her face, it all momentarily paralyzed me. Eliza moved slowly, tentatively into the cabin. The sudden heat from the dying embers combined with her exhaustion, the biting cold she'd just endured, and the emotional burden made her stagger slightly. She set her satchel down with a thud, her eyes, however, immediately fixed on Clara. The infant was trembling faintly, her cries now just rasping, desperate remnants of sound. Eliza's arms reached out instinctively, the movement of a mother who couldn't bear to see a child suffer. "May I?" she whispered, asking for permission where another person might have simply taken the child over, demanding control. I didn't hesitate for more than a second. My mind screamed, "Yes, God, yes, save her." I gently, reverently handed my daughter over to the warmth and purpose of her arms. Eliza sat on the old, scarred wooden stool near the hearth. She cradled Clara expertly in the crook of her arm, and with an almost clinical detachment, a focused maternal intensity, she unbuttoned the top of her soaking wet dress. I turned instantly, violently, my gaze snapping toward the dark, rattling window pane. It was a reflex of respect, of propriety, of the strange, unbreakable rules of the prairie, where even life-saving intimacy must be cloaked in distance. I stared out into the inky blackness, seeing only my own hollow reflection and the frantic, chaotic slash of the rain and snow. Behind me, the world went quiet. A soft, profoundly vital sound replaced the constant shriek of the wind, suckling. Wet, desperate, rhythmic, greedy. It was followed by a deep, shuddering exhale from the baby's tiny lungs. And then the silence returned, but this time it was the silence of nourishment. The silence of being saved. I closed my eyes, a single hot tear finally cutting a clean path through the grime and stubble on my cheek. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, it was louder than any of Clara's previous screams. It was the sound of a miracle. Eliza looked down at the tiny, ravenous face nested against her chest. Milk dribbled from the corner of Clara's mouth, a sure sign of satiety. For the first time since her own son died, I sensed a palpable loosening in her posture. A slight, almost miraculous easing of the terrible ache I'd seen perpetually reflected in her eyes. "She's so hungry, Ethan," she murmured, her voice thick, with residual tears and the wonder of the moment. Poor thing." I turned my head slightly still, not looking directly at her, still staring into the dark window. "She hasn't kept a single feeding down in almost a day and a half." I managed to choke out the effort of speaking, a pain in my throat. More silence. The silence of eating, of nourishing, of a bond being forged in grief and need. Then softly Eliza asked, "What was her name?" "Your wife's choice, Clara." I said, the sound of my late wife's choice, a fresh stab of pain but now mixed with gratitude. "Sarah named her. She said Clara means clear or bright." The firelight flickered weakly across the floor, catching the edge of the abandoned bottle. The cabin was utterly still, saved only for the soft, contented breaths of my daughter drinking. My hands were balled into tight fists at my sides, not from anger or pain, but from a confusing, overwhelming knot of pure relief, persistent grief, and a sense of absolute, profound indebtedness. I was saved by a woman who was herself broken beyond imagining. "She looks strong," Eliza murmured, her eyes softening, as she gently stroked Clara's back. Like her father. She'll fight. I swallowed the muscle in my throat, jumping hard. My voice, when it came, was nearly hushed out of existence. Thank you, Eliza. I don't know what to say. She looked up at me, her pale lips quivering, her gaze direct for the first time. I needed this too, Ethan, she said, her honesty brutal and complete. More than you could ever know. Let me stay until she's steady. By the third morning, a fragile, unspoken structure had settled over our lives. The tack room, once dedicated to dusty leather and stiff rope, had been swept clean, aired out against the stench of disuse, and quietly claimed by Eliza. I'd dragged in a cot myself, a simple frame with a thin straw mattress, and even mended the broken latch on the small high window, sealing out the worst of the wind. The change felt seismic, yet every necessary arrangement was handled without a word. Eliza woke before the rooster's crow, before the first weak gray light of dawn touched the horizon. I'd hear the quiet, almost conspiratorial sounds, the gentle clink of the tin cup being set down, the subdued scrape of her feet on the floorboards as she moved from her room to the main hearth. She boiled water, the steam rising like a grateful ghost in the cold morning air, adding dried willow bark and chamomile, an old remedy from her mother she'd explained once for calm and rest. She would place the steaming tin cup beside me, my thick, bitter coffee, without a word. A gesture that spoke volumes where all spoken language felt too clumsy, too heavy. Then she would gently lift Clara from the makeshift cradle I'd built from an apple crate and nurse her by the soft flickering firelight, a Madonna illuminated by necessity. Clara was already undergoing a miraculous transformation. Her skin was warmer to the touch, the frightening translucent pallor fading rapidly. Her cries were now merely loud, demanding protests, not the ragged sounds of despair. Her tiny fingers, once clenched in futile fury, would now curl securely, possessively around Eliza's shirt, as she drew steady, greedy breaths, drinking life back into her system. My own behavior around Eliza was marked by an agonizing, perpetual awkwardness. I didn't know how to look at her. My eyes were always fixed on the distant fields or the fire's logs. I didn't know how to thank her in a way that wouldn't cheapen her sacrifice, how to pay her, or how to acknowledge the unbearable, profound intimacy of what she was doing. She was giving my daughter life, a life purchased with her own recent unimaginable loss, a grief still radiating off her like cold smoke. So I worked. I buried my gratitude, my confusion, and my lingering grief in physical labor, the only honest language I knew. I spent hours outside fixing every foot of the fence line the brutal winter had broken, hauling wood, until my arms ached with a deep cleansing pain. But the gratitude, the acknowledgement found an outlet in small, quiet, necessary actions that required no eye contact, no spoken words. I would leave a bowl of my thick, warm, gamey stew for her on the table at lunch. She would eat it without comment. I folded the extra blanket I found and placed it at the foot of her cot, mended the squeaky hinges on the washroom door, and replaced the cracked pane of glass in the kitchen window. I even repaired the broken leg on the old rocking chair, the one she now used to nurse Clara, sanding the wood smooth until it was steady and completely silent. She rarely spoke first, preferring the quiet concentration of her grief. Every night, however, after Clara had fed and settled into deep, restorative sleep, we sat near the hearth. Eliza with her simple knitting, her hands moving with a meticulous grieving focus, creating small, fine things for a child that wasn't strictly speaking hers. I sat with a tin cup of coffee that inevitably cooled and grew bitter, untouched, my mind running endless, exhausting circles. Silence stretched between us, thick and encompassing. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a shared, almost sacred space, a presence that acknowledged two people had been cleaved from their former lives by the same kind of prairie cruelty. On the fifth night, after what felt like an hour of staring into the coals, Eliza broke it. The sound of her voice in the quiet room was so unexpected, it made me jump the same way I jumped whenever Clara whimpered. I held him for 2 days, Ethan, she said, her eyes fixed on the flickering orange flame, utterly still. Her voice was flat, empty of immediate emotion, which made the words all the more horrifying, all the more real. My boy, the fever it just took him, and then it left. I looked up, seeing the scene unfold in the horror reflected in her eyes, the stark image of a small cabin and a dead child. He just stopped breathing, she continued, her voice gaining a dreadful, painful steadiness. And I just sat there, waiting. For anyone. Someone to know. Someone to tell me what to do. I didn't know how to tell the ground to take him. Her fingers trembled slightly around the yarn she held. No one came. No one. Not until he started to smell. I didn't speak. There are truths so awful you cannot reply to them with words. They demand something deeper. I took her cold, nearly full tin cup and poured the dregs onto the ash, the small hissing sound a brief punctuation mark to her horror. I refilled it with fresh hot coffee, adding a small piece of brown sugar I'd found tucked away. I didn't look at her face. Instead, without a word, I fed another larger log to the fire, pushing it deep into the coals. The flames roared up bright and violent, chasing the lingering shadows away. Eliza gave me a small shaky nod of gratitude, a slight bend of her head that was barely perceptible. That was our language. Action acknowledgement, not words. She never had to ask for help with Clara. When it was time for the nursing, I always made myself scarce. I'd step outside into the biting night or retreat to the barn to oil the saddles, returning only to find Eliza rocking Clara, a look of deep restorative peace on her face. A look that hadn't touched her in months, maybe years, until Clara's needs called it forth. I never commented on the peace I saw, but once she noticed I had wrapped a hot stone in thick cloth and placed it discreetly beside the rocker, warming her feet. While she Saturday, she didn't say thank you. I didn't need her to. Our conversations grew longer, deeper, moving beyond the necessities of the day, moving past the mutual horrors. She told me about her parents back east, the dusty, indifferent town she'd come from, the crushing poverty. She spoke of coming to Colorado with her late husband, a miner, who died in a roof cave-in before their son was born, a man she barely knew, a marriage of desperate convenience. In return, I spoke about Sarah. I talked about our courtship during that brutally hot harvest season when the dust was so thick it coated the back of your throat, and how she had once, against all common sense and my own warnings, tamed a wild Mustang faster and better than any man I knew, using only her quiet patience. She was soft-spoken, Eliza. I remembered my voice cracking slightly, but when she told a horse to stop, it stopped. She had this quiet, commanding strength. Eliza smiled faintly, the first real, unforced smile I'd seen on her. It was a beautiful, fleeting flash of something lost, now found again in shared memory. Sounds like she was the strong one, then she murmured. She was, I agreed, the truth landing heavily in the quiet room. And she left me with the clearest, brightest thing she had. That's what Clara means, you know. Clear. Bright. Each night the silence between us began to feel less like the empty absence of sound, and more like a profound shared understanding, a language of two survivors. Neither of us reached for the other. We didn't dare cross that fragile line of respect and grief. But sometimes when our eyes met in the thick orange glow of the hearth, something cautious, something gentle but absolutely real, passed between us. It wasn't love yet. It was healing. And in that quiet, wind-battered corner of the valley, it was more than either of us had any right to hope for again. The storm had rolled in fast, a nasty, unexpected surprise, turning the rutted dirt road into a thick, clinging, impassable mud. I was already agitated when Eliza returned from her trip to town. She'd gone for flour, salt, and soap, the necessities of a life that was finally finding routine, but she came back carrying something heavier, the whispers of the valley. Spring was stirring beneath the last of the frost, and the market was crowded with ranchers eager for supplies. But no warmth touched the eyes that tracked Eliza's movements. She heard it all before she even reached the mercantile steps. Not to her face, of course, that takes courage. But the ranchers' wives would turn their backs a fraction too slowly, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry the poison through the spring air. She's living with him, you know. Just waiting for the Caldwell name. Didn't wait long, did she? A widow feeding another woman's child like it's her own. It's unnatural against God's design. Milk isn't the only thing she's offering the widower, I hear. He's a strong man, she needs protection. When she returned, she was pale and stiff, her hands white-knuckled on the canvas sack. She handed me the supplies with a trembling hand and disappeared into the tack room without a word. I watched her go, my heart sinking. I knew what had happened. I didn't ask, not wanting to make her speak the vile words aloud. I knew the signs of the world trying to crush the little joy we had salvaged. That night, while I was nailing down a loose banging board on the porch roof trying to seal out the gathering moisture, I overheard two ranch hands from the neighboring spread riding by in the dusk. They stopped just out of sight of the cabin. "Betty's got her warming his bed too," one muttered, his voice coarse and cruel, dripping with envy and judgment. The other laughed a short, vicious bark. Hell wouldn't blame him, but I just don't see why the kid's got a drink from someone else's tit. Tastes like charity and it smells like sin. The hammer in my hand stopped moving. It tightened in my grip until the wood handle bit deep into my palm and my knuckles went white with effort. I watched the shadows of the men ride off until the darkness and the closing fog swallowed them completely. I said nothing. I did nothing. I was a rancher, a father, a grieving widower, not a common brawler. But when I returned inside, the silence in the cabin felt different, heavy-loaded, pressurized, ready to explode. Dinner remained untouched on the table. Eliza sat motionless in the rocker, Clara asleep in her arms, her head bowed in silent communion with her pain. She didn't look up when I entered. I placed the food down, waited a long, agonizing moment for her to acknowledge me, then turned and stepped back outside. I couldn't breathe in the house. The weight of the air was too much. The rain started before midnight, a cold, thin sheet of ice that coated the trees. Eliza had not moved for hours. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't spoken a single word since returning from town. Her eyes were locked on the embers of the fire, as if she was trying to draw the last residual heat of the cabin into her soul to protect herself from the cold judgment of the outside world. The silence around her was now something far deeper than shame. It was fear. Not fear for her reputation that was already gone, shredded by vicious talk, but fear for Clara. Fear that her presence was somehow corrupting the child, making Clara the subject of small-town viciousness and the target of my creditors who were waiting to claim everything. In the blackest hour of the night, while I slept in the front room, a cold light sleep with the rifle leaning against the wall and my boots still on ready for trouble, Eliza slipped from her cot. I was jolted awake not by sound, but by an instinct. A sudden, cold sense of absence. I sat up fast, rifle instantly in hand. The cradle was empty. Clara's favorite quilt, the one I had draped over the crib, was gone. So was Eliza's shawl, her coat, and Eliza herself. My boots were on in seconds, laced hastily. I grabbed my heavy coat, flung the door open, and was struck by a blast of sleet and wind that drove the breath from my lungs. The rain had turned to a thick, driving snow sometime after midnight. The storm was a full, violent blizzard. Now thick, blinding flakes swirling across the field, the wind howling down from the ridge like a hunting dog closing in for the kill. "Eliza," I shouted, the sound immediately muffled and devoured by the maelstrom. I stepped off the porch and sank deep into the new drifts, the snow reaching past my ankles. "Eliza." Clara. No answer came. Only the hiss of the ice against the wood, the bitter, cruel breath of the prairie. I ran toward the barn, stumbling through the heavy drifts, fumbling frantically with the heavy latch. It was empty. Then I mounted my gelding bareback, kicking the horse into a desperate plunging motion, before the cold could fully settle in my bones. The snow flew sideways, blinding me, stinging my face like sand. The faint, weak light of the cabin disappeared instantly behind me, swallowed by the chaos. Where could she have gone? And with Clara? The child hadn't fed since before sunset. She was so small, so fragile, too small for this kind of cold, this kind of wind. My voice cracked as I shouted again, the sound ragged with terror and panic. Then, through the chaotic sheets of white, I saw it, the faintest flicker of movement, at the old dilapidated lumber shed near the farthest forgotten edge of my property. A broken door swinging uselessly, a brief pale flash of fabric, her shawl. I dismounted before the horse fully stopped tumbling into the deep drifts, scrambling toward the open door. Inside the shed, the air was cold and stale, smelling heavily of old pine dust and rust. In one corner, curled against a precarious stack of split logs, Eliza Saturday. She was hunched over her dress and coat soaked through, clutching Clara tight against her chest, attempting to shield her with her own body. She didn't look up, trapped in her own private hell of shame and despair. Clara was whimpering, weak and tired, making small, exhausted noises. Eliza rocked her with a frenetic, desperate motion, as if that physical rhythm alone could hold the pieces of the world together. I stepped into the cold, dark shelter and dropped instantly to my knees beside them. The snow was already gathering in a fine layer on the shoulders of my coat. "Eliza," I whispered, my voice low, and broke in the air, punched from my lungs by the sheer terror of finding them both alive. Look at me, damn it." She did. Her face was a mask of wet streaks, tears, and melting snow, her lips trembling violently, chapped raw by the wind. I thought maybe I shouldn't stay." She stammered the words, barely formed, lost and confused. "They're right. The town. They're right. I'm not her mother. I shouldn't be here. I'll only bring ruin on you both." I reached out, my hands trembling as I pulled my thick coat off and wrapped it tightly around both of them, a cocoon of dry wool, careful not to pull Clara from her embrace. I pressed my face close to her wet, cold hair, needing to feel her substance, her warmth. "You listen to me, Eliza Rowe," I whispered, the words ragged with a sudden profound conviction that shook me to my core. "You didn't take her from me. You didn't steal anything. You gave her back to me. You gave us both a future." Eliza's breath hitched violently in her throat. Her eyes went wide, the shock of my certainty and my devotion momentarily overpowering her fear and her shame. Then the tears came harder, a massive weeping wave of grief, relief, and exhaustion. She pressed her face into my shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably for her lost son, for the baby safe in her arms, for the shame and the silence and the aching fear she had just endured. I held her tighter, anchoring myself to her warmth, to the certainty of her living presence. The snow howled outside, a forgotten distant sound. Inside the shed there was only warmth now, not from fire but from skin, from breath, from the overwhelming, heavy, beautiful weight of two broken people who had nearly lost something too precious to even name, finding salvation in each other. We stayed like that for a long time. Eliza curled completely into my arms, finally resting. Clara safely sandwiched between us, the child's breathing softening into deep, contented sleep. I reached up and gently brushed the wet, matted hair from Eliza's forehead, my thumb resting against her temple. "You don't ever have to run again," I murmured, my lips close to her ear, the vow absolute. "Not from me. Not from this place. You stay here. With us." And for the first time since I'd met her, for the first time since her own tragedy, Eliza finally let herself believe it. She leaned into me, completely accepting the promise, and this time she didn't pull away. The storm had spent its fury by morning, leaving the valley covered in a breathtaking silver crust of snow, glittering sharply under a sky that was now cloudless, cold, and a brilliant, clean blue like polished steel. The world felt newly washed, renewed. Inside the Caldwell house, the hearth was roaring, the fire crackling with a deep, confident heat, and something else lingered in the air, a new, undeniable sense of purpose, of permanence. Eliza stirred, first waking to the scent of fresh, hot bread. A loaf I'd started proofing before the storm hit finally baked, and the soft, rhythmic sound of steady hammering coming from the back room. She sat up slowly, still wrapped completely in my thick, damp coat, smelling faintly of pine and my own sweat. Clara stirred beside her in the borrowed cradle, cheeks rosy with good sleep, arms stretched out like a tiny blossom warmed by the returning Sunday. She remembered where she was and what had happened. She felt the heavy, quiet weight of the choice she'd almost made and the terrifying, unconditional acceptance I'd given her. Then she heard the hammering again, resolute and certain. She rose, tucked Clara close, and moved quietly toward the sound, which came from the small, unused room next to mine. A room Sarah and I had once vaguely planned for a nursery. Through the cracked open door she saw me kneeling on the wooden floor, sleeves rolled high to my elbows. My hands, which had trembled in the face of my daughter's hunger, were now steady and smooth, running over the edge of a new wooden crib. I was finishing a task I'd begun weeks ago in my grief, carving wood to keep my hands busy but never dared to complete. The morning light from the window fell across my back as I carved slow, careful, deep letters into the headboard. First Clara, and underneath smaller, neater Caldwell. The wood shavings curled away, smelling sweet and sharp. I ran a rough hand over the finished name, smoothing the edges as if sealing a promise into the wood itself. Then without turning I spoke softly, my voice tight. "I wasn't sure how to ask this of you." Eliza's breath caught in her throat, a small, audible gasp. I stood, wiped the sawdust from my sleeves with a rag, and stepped aside so she could enter the room. It was freshly swept and clean. A braided rug I'd saved from Sarah's things lay near the bed. A folded quilt was at the foot. There was a small shelf lined with the few wooden toys I'd carved for Clara when she was still in the womb, useless gifts until now. And on a small table by the window, a clean piece of brown paper was weighted down with a smooth, heavy creak stone. She stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The brilliant morning light caught the words written in my familiar, firm, uneven script, bolder now than the note I'd nailed to the porch. "Stay." Underneath, in a smaller, almost hesitant script, a small underlined addition, not as a helper, as her mother, as my wife. Her hands began to tremble again, but this time from a different kind of shock. The shock of being wanted, needed, chosen. Behind her I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, boots, still damp hair mussed my eyes, holding a rare, profound vulnerability. This wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. It wasn't a promise made with rings or flowery vows spoken on one knee. It was an invitation, a necessary choice offered in the hardest, simplest, most honest language I knew. Eliza looked down at Clara, cradled warm and safe in her arms. The baby blinked up at her content, and warm cheeks full and mouth wet with milk from the dawn feeding. A single hot tear slid down Eliza's cheek, but she was smiling a fierce, radiant, magnificent smile that banished the last of the cabin's shadows. She pressed her lips to Clara's forehead, a silent acceptance of the child, then looked up at me, her gaze steady, unflinching. "I didn't just save her, Ethan," she said, her voice a barely there whisper heavy with the magnitude of her truth. "She saved me too. She gave me back the right to be a mother." I took a step closer, near enough that I could smell the faint, clean scent of wood smoke and damp wool clinging to her. But I didn't touch her. I waited for her final word. "I never thought I'd have another family, Eliza," I admitted, my eyes fixed on the ceiling beam, avoiding her powerful gaze. "I never planned on this second chance or the fear of losing it." Eliza nodded, the simple gesture conveying a lifetime of understanding. "Me either. But the Lord works in ways we don't understand. He took one child and gave me another to hold." She looked around the small room again. The crib, the blanket, the toys. Every detail had been carved not from obligation but from a profound sense of necessity. It wasn't a grand home, but it was safe. It was offered unconditionally. And for someone who had spent months aching for a place to belong, a reason to get out of bed, it was everything. We stood in silence, not needing more words to confirm the vow. The air between us was suddenly filled with the low hiss of the fire, the rustle of Clara's contented breathing, and the quiet echo of something, beginning something that transcended grief. Not loudly, not suddenly, but surely. That evening, Eliza tucked Clara into the new crib. Her fingers lingered on the carved letters, tracing each curve as if to promise, "I choose this. I choose her. I choose us." She then looked out the window. The stars were visible, bright and sharp in the clean night sky. The wind no longer howled, it simply hummed. Outside, melted snow dripped in slow, rhythmic drops from the roof eaves. And for the first time since the fever took her, son Eliza slept without waking from dreams. She was no longer a helper, no longer a visitor, but a mother, a partner. The air that next morning felt too still, that heavy, charged silence that comes just before something breaks, before the world catches up to a man's momentary happiness. Eliza was at the hearth rocking Clara, humming a quiet tune, when she saw the dust cloud rising from the south trail. It wasn't just wind, and it wasn't a friendly neighbor. 4 men on horseback, thick coats, wide hats, strangers, creditors. I was already at the door, having seen them coming miles off. My rancher's eye was always scanning the horizon for trouble. My hand settled on the rifle, leaning just inside the jam. Eliza stepped onto the porch behind me, Clara tucked close to her chest. Her instincts tightened like a fist in my chest. "Stay inside, Eliza," I said, my voice quiet but firm, a command born of protection. She hesitated, her fear for the baby overcoming her immediate obedience. I turned to her, my expression softening slightly to a look of profound, desperate love. "Please, this is my fight. Keep her safe." She nodded, the terror still etched on her face, and slipped back into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar, a silent acknowledgement of her fear and her trust. The men dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, heavy with ill intent. One of them, older, broad-shouldered, with a cruel, thin mouth and a worn leather ledger in his hand, stepped forward. Ethan Caldwell, the man called, his voice booming and arrogant across the silent yard, challenging the quiet peace we had just built. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang there, absorbing his challenge, taking his measure. "You inherited some debts, Caldwell," the man continued, flipping the ledger open with a snap. "From your wife's side. Land notes signed by Mary Turner, or rather Sarah Caldwell, a year before she died. They're past due. And the interest has compounded, Mr. Caldwell." "I know about the notes," I said, squaring my shoulders, holding my ground. My voice was low, steady, not giving him the satisfaction of panic. "This property covers the balance," the man declared, his eyes cold and devoid of mercy. "We're here to take what's owed. The title is forfeit." Silence stretched thick and poisonous. Inside, I knew Eliza was frozen, every breath shallow, listening. She couldn't hear every word, but the tone of command and threat was clear enough. Another man, younger, eager for violence, added, stepping closer, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his pistol. "You can stay on the land, Caldwell, but only if you work it for us. Half of everything you grow, everything you raise. It's ours. You become our tenant." My voice came through low and clear, fueled by a terrible, blazing new resolve, a commitment to the woman and the child inside. "No, I will not be anyone's tenant. The second man scoffed, moving his hand on his gun grip, tightening his stance. Then maybe we tear down this cabin. Take what's worth hauling. Sell the baby's cradle for firewood. That was when I heard it, the subtle, unmistakable, deadly click of a hammer being cocked on one of the other men's rifles. My heart slammed into my ribs, demanding action. I knew the men were ready to shoot, but the shot never came because I spoke first, faster. My voice cut through the tension like a whip, louder, now imbued with a desperate, absolute finality. You touch one board on this house, I swore, my eyes locked on the leader, my gaze boring into his soul. You touch one thing that belongs to them, to Clara or to Eliza, and I swear to God I'll bury the debt with your bones and those of your companions. A long, tense, agonizing silence followed. I stood tall, unflinching, but the rifle in my hand remained lowered. I was ready, not reckless. I was defending a life, not seeking a fight. I've got a better idea, I finally said, the moment of violence passing. I lowered the rifle slightly, offering a strategic compromise. You want payment? Fine. Take the south field. It's the roughest patch of ground on this spread. I'll work it and I'll give you half the yield at season's end. You collect every fall until the debt is paid in full. The older man narrowed his eyes, chewing on the offer, calculating the risk versus the immediate hassle of a gunfight. If the crop fails, if the land rejects my seed, then I owe you nothing, I continued, reading the uncertainty in his eyes. Same risk you'd take if you seized it now and had to hire hands. But if it grows, if it's a good year, you'll get more than you came for. And no blood spilled today. No bodies to bury. The men exchanged glances, weighing the immediate confrontation and legal expense against the potential profit without effort. Finally, the older one nodded slowly, grudgingly. Fine. You've got until harvest. Don't cross me, Caldwell. They mounted their horses again and rode off without another word, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats, the settling dust, and a thick, lingering silence behind them. I stood there until the sound faded completely, my jaw tight, my breath visible in the morning chill. When I came back into the house, Eliza was waiting by the hearth, Clara in her arms. I walked straight past the kitchen, through the living room to the place where she stood. I looked at the baby, first touching her head gently, ensuring she was oblivious to the danger. Then my eyes met Eliza's. No one threatens what I've built, I said quietly, the vow burning in my throat like hot whiskey. Not again. Never again. Eliza said nothing at first. She just looked at me, the soot on my coat, the tight line of my mouth, the way my shoulders carried every weight without complaint. She saw the protector, the husband, the father. Then she reached up and placed her hand flat against my chest, right where my heart beat strong beneath the flannel. It was the first time she had touched me like that. Not out of need, not from fear, but from something far deeper, shared ownership, silent thanks, absolute trust. A vow. A beginning sealed in the face of death. 3 years had passed since that cold, terrifying morning in the lumber shed. 3 full seasons since Eliza and I sealed our vow. Not with rings or words, but with shared danger and a child's survival. The storms were fewer now. The winds gentler, and the land, having accepted its new inhabitants, was kinder. The sun stretched over the Caldwell homestead, golden and wide, warming the earth that once seemed too cold for second chances. The south field, the roughest patch I'd wagered to the creditors, had yielded a surprisingly strong crop each year, and the debt slowly but surely was shrinking. Clara's laughter, bright, true, and fearless, rang through the air like wind chimes as she chased a blue ribbon tied to the tail of a kite across the newly green yard. She was nearly 4 now, quick-footed, sharp-eyed, and as bright as a prairie morning, a constant living miracle. Eliza sat on the porch steps, a hand resting gently on her swollen belly. She was due any day. Her hair had grown longer, streaked by the relentless summer sun, and her cheeks carried the gentle fullness of late pregnancy. She watched Clara play with the quiet, profound smile of someone who had known deep sorrow and had deliberately, painstakingly chosen joy. Inside the barn, I was finishing a task I'd begun the winter before, a task that represented the final permanent shift in our lives. I was carving a new wooden sign for the gate. My hands were steady now, my cuts precise. The letters were bold and clean. Caldwell and Rowe Ranch. Not just mine anymore. Not just hers. Ours. The 2 names joined by choice, not by force of law or blood, but by the deeper, more profound law of shared survival and mutual devotion. I wiped my brow, brushed the sawdust from my sleeves, and stepped outside to where Eliza waited. She looked up at me, shielding her eyes from the bright afternoon Sunday. "Finished?" she asked, her voice heavy with anticipation. I held up the sign, letting the sun catch the freshly oiled wood. She smiled, a deep, beautiful, satisfied smile. It looks solid. Looks like it's real now. It's been real a long time, Eliza, I said softly, my eyes moving between her and the life growing within her, the evidence of our bond. This just makes it official. It tells the world who we are. Together we walked to the fence line where Clara was kneeling in the dirt with a small trowel waiting for us. Beside her stood a slender sapling, a white apple tree from a cutting I had nursed for months in the shed. Eliza crouched beside Clara, guiding her small hands as they dug the hole deep and wide enough to accept the young roots. I placed the tree gently into the earth, covered the roots with the dark, rich soil, and packed the dirt firm with my heel. We stood back as a soft breeze tugged at the tiny leaves, the first of many breaths the tree would take in its long anchored life. What if it doesn't grow, Papa? Clara asked, squinting up at me the question, a whisper of the old fear that still lingered in the air of the valley. I knelt beside her, brushing a curl of her hair from her face. Then we try again, baby. We try until the roots take hold. But this one's strong. It'll fight, like you. And Mama, Clara added, looking up at Eliza, the word mama slipping easily from her lips. I looked at Eliza, her hand resting heavily on her belly, the wind catching her sun-streaked hair. She's the strongest of us all, I confirmed, my voice thick with pride and love. She taught us both how to grow again. We stood in silence, watching the tree settle into its new permanent home. The white apple blossoms had not yet bloomed, but they would in time, just as this family had rooted in pain, nourished by choice, destined for renewal. That night, as the stars spread like wildflowers over the vast black canvas of the sky, I sat on the porch with Eliza beside me, her head resting against my shoulder, the weight of her presence a profound comfort. Clara slept inside her arms, wrapped around the stuffed mare I'd carved for her last Christmas, a peaceful, perfect portrait. The fire in the hearth glowed steady through the window, a warm red pulse in the dark. Eliza's voice was quiet, thoughtful, almost drowsy. You know what I think about sometimes, Ethan, tell me? How I came here with nothing but milk and grief. And the world had given up on me. And now, she trailed off, unable to articulate the immensity of the change. I kissed the top of her head, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of chamomile and soap that clung to her hair. You gave her more than milk, Eliza. You gave her a mother. You gave me back my life, my purpose. Eliza looked down at her belly, then out toward the faint shadow of the new tree. She gave me more than I ever gave her. She gave me you, and a reason to live past the loss. A reason to use this milk, this life, this heart. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Our story wasn't written in bloodlines or property deeds. It wasn't about fate or family names inherited carelessly. It was about choice, about showing up, staying through the storm, and choosing to love what the world once told you not to. I reached for her hand, threading my fingers through hers, the rough skin of my palm resting against the softness of her wrist. She didn't come to save a baby, Eliza. I said the words, echoing my deepest, oldest realization. She came to save herself. And somehow in the deepest part of that blizzard, we all got saved together. Eliza smiled, her eyes glistening faintly in the dark, the promise of the coming child filling the space between us. The wind stirred the young leaves outside. The new sign swung gently on its hooks, Caldwell and Rowe Ranch. And beneath that apple tree, a promise rooted deeper than any fear or debt. If this tree ever blooms, our love is still alive. And every spring I knew it would bloom magnificently. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.